Welcome to Module 3A, Establishing the Business Continuity Plan. The purpose of this module is direct to explain how an approved business impact analysis becomes an authorized and usable business continuity plan. The BIA defines what must recover. It identifies protected outcomes, critical activities, time-based requirements, minimum acceptable capacity, dependencies, and consequences of disruption. But the BIA does not recover the business. The BCP is the management arrangement that translates those requirements into authority, actions, resources, responsibilities, records, decisions, controls, and usable recovery logic. In this module, the BCP is treated as more than a document. It is an approved recovery arrangement. That distinction matters. A document may describe intent. A recovery arrangement assigns ownership, confirms dependencies, defines activation design, coordinates specialist plans, and provides a controlled basis for action when disruption threatens critical outcomes. The management outcome of this module is an approved, usable BIA-linked BCP. Its focus is plan establishment, not live incident command. We will therefore stay within the boundary of Module 3A. We will cover plan design, activation levels, dependency ownership, plan structure, asset loss arrangements, minimum acceptable capacity, recovery sequencing, and approval readiness. We will not cover live command, situation reporting, real-time resource dispatch, workaround execution, recovery monitoring, return to normal execution, or post-incident handover. Those belong to Module 3B. The central question for this module is simple. What must the plan contain? Authorize, coordinate, and control before disruption occurs. The first design task is to convert BIA requirements into BCP arrangements. The BIA gives the approved recovery basis. It identifies the outcomes that must be protected, the activities that enable those outcomes, the maximum tolerable period of disruption, the recovery time objective, the recovery point objective where applicable, the minimum acceptable capacity, and the dependencies that must be available for recovery to be possible. The BCP takes those inputs and turns them into management arrangements. It defines activation criteria and activation levels. It identifies recovery priorities. It assigns authority, roles, teams, alternates, and decision records. It identifies the resources needed to support continuity. It links critical dependencies to owners, validation methods, escalation paths, and update triggers. It defines communication arrangements, records, document control, maintenance, and review requirements. This translation is important because business continuity fails when analysis remains separate from execution design. A strong BCP does not merely repeat the BIA. It converts impact requirements into assigned and controlled arrangements that people can use. For example, if the BIA says an activity must operate at a minimum level within a defined time, the BCP must identify who activates the arrangement, what minimum capacity means, what dependencies are required first, who owns those dependencies, which supporting plans must interface, and what records confirm control. In practical terms, the BCP becomes the bridge between analysis and recovery readiness. The quality of that bridge determines whether the plan is usable or merely complete on paper. The baseline governance model is intentionally simple. BCMS governs, the BCP coordinates, and specialist plans execute. The business continuity management system sets the governance environment. It provides policy, scope, leadership, review, audit, exercises, corrective action, continual improvement, and overall system control. It is the management system that ensures business continuity is planned, maintained, reviewed, and improved. The BCP sits inside that governance environment as the coordinating plan. It does not replace the management system, and it does not become the container for every specialist document. Its role is to coordinate continuity priorities, activation design, authority, dependency arrangements, communication interfaces, resource coordination, records, sequencing, and maintenance controls. Specialist plans then execute the technical or functional response required in their own domains. These may include emergency response, IT disaster recovery, cyber response, crisis communication, and notification procedures where applicable. The point is not to multiply documents, the point is to clarify accountability. If the BCMS is expected to execute every technical action, governance becomes unrealistic. If the BCP attempts to contain every specialist procedure, the plan becomes oversized and difficult to use. If specialist plans operate with no BCP coordination, recovery may become fragmented. The preferred architecture avoids these failures. The BCMS governs the discipline. The BCP coordinates the continuity arrangement. Specialist plans execute their defined procedures. That separation keeps the BCP focused, usable, and aligned to approved BIA requirements. A clean BCP architecture separates the core plan from the supporting material needed to execute and maintain it. The core BCP should remain concise enough to use under pressure and controlled enough to support governance. It defines scope, activation criteria, activation levels, authority, recovery priorities, key roles, dependency coordination, resource coordination, communication interfaces, records, stand-down design, maintenance triggers, and document control. Around that core plan, the organization may maintain annexes, action cards, controlled lists, and specialist supporting plans. Annexes may provide department-specific recovery information. Action cards may summarize defined responsibilities for key roles. Controlled lists may contain cold trees, suppliers, systems, sites, documents, or other reference information that must remain current. Specialist supporting plans remain separate where their technical depth would overload the BCP. This architecture is practical because a BCP becomes weak when everything is forced into one document. A bloated plan is difficult to maintain, harder to approve, and unlikely to be used effectively during disruption. A clean architecture also supports document control. The core plan can remain stable while controlled lists and annexes are updated when personnel, suppliers, systems, or dependencies change. The design principle is simple. The core plan coordinates continuity. Annexes and controlled lists provide managed detail. Specialist plans execute specialist procedures. This preserves the baseline's governance model and keeps the BCP usable. In short, structure is not cosmetic. Structure determines whether the plan can be governed, understood, updated, and applied. Activation levels must be designed before disruption occurs. The BCP should not wait for a crisis to decide what activation means, who declares it, what authority applies, what records are required, and which supporting plans are triggered. The baseline distinguishes monitoring, partial activation, full activation, and crisis escalation interface. Monitoring means heightened readiness. There may be an emerging or possible disruption, but the BCP has not necessarily been activated. The appropriate design focus is awareness, validation of availability, communication preparation, and readiness review. Partial activation applies when disruption affects a specific activity, site, process, supplier, technology, department, or asset loss module. In this case, only part of the continuity arrangement may be required. Full activation applies when multiple critical activities, major dependencies, or cross-functional impacts require coordinated recovery. Full activation is more likely to require executive prioritization because scarce resources, dependencies, and competing recovery needs must be managed deliberately. Crisis escalation is a defined interface. It may be required when strategic objectives, reputation, legal standing, public safety, liquidity, compliance, or organizational viability may be threatened. The BCP should define who can declare each activation level, who can act as alternate authority, what decisions must be recorded, what escalation and de-escalation criteria apply, and which specialist plans are triggered. This remains Module 3A design. It is not live command. The value of activation design is that the organization makes authority and trigger decisions before disruption creates confusion. The BCP must treat dependencies as controlled recovery requirements, not as passive lists. A dependency named without an owner is a control weakness. Critical activities rely on people, workspace, technology, data, records, suppliers, utilities, equipment, transport, logistics, regulatory or contractual interfaces, and communication channels. If these dependencies are merely listed, the plan may look complete while still being operationally weak. The baseline requires each critical dependency to have ownership. At minimum, the plan should define the dependency owner, alternate owner, linked critical activity, resource or supplier description, recovery requirement, escalation path, workaround owner, validation method, and update trigger. This creates accountability. The dependency owner is responsible for keeping the dependency information current and for confirming whether the dependency remains realistic for the recovery requirement it supports. The alternate owner prevents the arrangement from failing when one individual is unavailable. The linked activity explains why the dependency matters. The recovery requirement defines what level of availability is needed. The escalation path identifies where unresolved dependency issues should go. The validation method explains how the dependency is checked. The update trigger ensures the plan changes when the underlying dependency changes. This is especially important where one dependency supports multiple critical activities. Without ownership, dependency failure can become invisible until the point of disruption. With ownership, the BCP becomes a controlled map of what must be available for recovery to be possible. Dependency ownership is therefore not administrative detail. It is a core readiness control. The baseline simplifies the BCP into 5 practical blocks. The first block is scope and activation. This defines what the plan covers, when it may be activated, who has authority, what levels of activation exist, and what escalation interfaces apply. The second block is priorities and recovery requirements. This links the plan to the BIA by identifying critical activities, recovery objectives, minimum acceptable capacity, resources, dependencies, and priority logic. The third block is roles, authority, resources, and dependency ownership. This block makes the plan operationally accountable by assigning responsibilities, alternates decision rights, required resources, dependency owners, and escalation paths. The fourth block is recovery arrangements, communications, and support plan interfaces. This describes the design of recovery arrangements, communication coordination, internal and external interfaces, and the connection points with specialist plans such as emergency response, IT disaster recovery, cyber response, or crisis communication. The fifth block is records, stand-down design, maintenance, and document control. This block ensures the plan can be controlled, reviewed, updated, approved, accessed, and maintained over time. The 5-block structure is valuable because it is simple enough for management review and practical enough for plan users. It prevents the BCP from becoming an uncontrolled binder. It also avoids the opposite problem, a high-level document that lacks authority, ownership, and recovery detail. The structure supports governance, usability, approval, and maintenance. A BCP built around these 5 blocks is easier to review, easier to explain, and easier to keep aligned with BIA requirements. Asset loss planning is a practical way to design BCP arrangements without creating an endless hazard catalog. Many different events can lead to the same operational consequence: a fire, access restriction, utility failure, or security issue may all create loss of workspace. A system failure, cyber issue, infrastructure outage, or connectivity problem may create loss of technology. Absence, travel restriction, injury, or unavailability may create loss of personnel. A logistics issue, service failure, contract disruption, or external incident may create loss of a supplier or third party. The BCP should therefore define arrangements for common capability losses. The baseline identifies modules such as loss of workspace, loss of technology, loss of personnel, and loss of supplier or third party. Each module should connect to minimum acceptable capacity and recovery sequencing. Minimum acceptable capacity means the lowest acceptable level of operation needed to survive within tolerable impact limits. It is not full restoration, it is the first viable level of continuity. Sequencing then determines what must happen first because recovery cannot occur in a random order. Prerequisite dependencies must be restored before dependent activities. Survival level capacity should be restored before full normal capacity. Non-critical work should be deferred when resources are constrained. Scarce resources should be allocated by BIA priority and management direction. The sequence should identify dependencies, owners, escalation paths, success criteria, and decision records. This design logic makes the BCP practical. It converts many disruption scenarios into manageable capability loss arrangements and recovery sequences. A BCP should not be approved merely because the document is finished. Approval should confirm readiness. The baseline provides an approval-readiness test that checks whether the plan is sufficiently linked, authorized, owned, resourced, usable, coordinated, accessible, protected, controlled, and approved. The first test is BIA linkage. The plan must reflect approved BIA requirements and not disconnected assumptions. The second test is authority. The plan must identify who can activate arrangements, make decisions, and approve escalation. The third test is dependency ownership. Critical dependencies must have owners, alternates, validation methods, and update triggers. The fourth test is resource readiness. Required people, sites, systems, suppliers, information, and other resources must be sufficiently defined for the plan to be usable. The fifth test is usability. The plan must be understandable, structured, and practical for intended users. The sixth test is coordination. The BCP must connect with relevant specialist plans and interfaces. The seventh test is access. The plan must be available when normal access routes may be disrupted. The eighth test is confidentiality. Sensitive information must be protected. The ninth test is version control. Users must know which version is current and controlled. The 10th test is formal approval. The plan must be approved by the correct authority. This readiness view is important for executives and auditors. It changes the approval question from "Is the document complete?" to "Is the recovery arrangement ready to be relied upon?" BCPs often fail before disruption because they are established incorrectly. The baseline identifies predictable mistakes. The first is binder thinking, treating the BCP as a document instead of an authorized recovery arrangement. A binder can exist without authority, ownership, resources, or usability. The second mistake is unclear activation design. If monitoring, partial activation, full activation, and crisis escalation are not defined, decision-making becomes improvised. The third mistake is ownerless dependencies. A dependency list without owners, alternates validation methods, and update triggers gives false assurance. The fourth mistake is missing asset loss design. A plan that lists hazards but does not define arrangements for common capability losses may be too fragmented to use. The fifth mistake is weak recovery sequencing. Minimum acceptable capacity is not enough if the plan does not identify prerequisite dependencies and the order in which recovery must occur. The sixth mistake is an oversized BCP. When specialist plans, detailed technical procedures, and uncontrolled lists are forced into the core plan, usability declines. The seventh mistake is missing alternates for key authorities or dependency owners. The eighth mistake is documentation-only approval, where completion is mistaken for readiness. The ninth mistake is poor offline access or weak controlled distribution. A plan that cannot be accessed or that is uncontrolled when distributed creates additional risk. These mistakes have one common theme. They confuse documentation with readiness. A strong BCP is not just written, It is authorized, owned, structured, controlled, accessible, and aligned to BIA requirements. This closes Module 3A. The main point is that the BCP makes recovery possible before disruption occurs. It does this by converting approved BIA requirements into assigned, resourced, authorized, controlled, and usable recovery arrangements. It identifies what must be recovered, what level of capacity is acceptable, who has authority, who owns dependencies, what resources are required, which specialist plans must interface, how recovery should be sequenced, and what evidence is needed for approval readiness. The BCP also clarifies that business continuity is not one document and not one team's responsibility. The BCMS governs, the BCP coordinates, specialist plans execute. A clean architecture keeps those responsibilities clear. Partial activation, full activation, and crisis escalation are designed before disruption, not invented during disruption. Dependencies are owned and validated. The five-block structure gives the plan a practical shape. Asset loss arrangements prevent the plan from becoming an endless hazard list. Minimum acceptable capacity and sequencing keep the recovery design realistic. The approval readiness test confirms that the plan is usable, controlled, and aligned to the BIA. The boundary of this module remains important. We have established the design. We have not covered live command, situation reporting, real-time resource dispatch, workaround execution, recovery monitoring, return to normal execution, or post-incident handover. Those topics belong to Module 3B. The next step is to take this approved design and explain how the organization activates, coordinates, executes, and stands down the BCP during a real disruption.